To the family of Mr. Islam and the family of Malcolm X that I apologize for what were serious, unacceptable violations of law and the public trust. I apologize on behalf of our nation's law enforcement for this decades-long injustice, which has eroded public faith in institutions that are designed to guarantee equal protection of the law. Your Honor, we can't restore what was taken away from these men and their families. But by correcting the record, perhaps we can begin to restore that faith. We began, Your Honor, by committing to reinvestigate this matter through our Conviction Integrity Program. And I'm here today at Council table with Deputy Chief Charles King and our General Counsel, Carrie Dunn, who worked hand in hand with the Innocence Project and the Cheney's law firm on this 2-year reinvestigation and a joint motion which we have now submitted to the court. As detailed in our papers, there are 2 grounds for our motion: newly discovered evidence and the failure to disclose exculpatory evidence. There is only one ultimate conclusion. Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam were wrongfully convicted of the crime. Since January 2020, my office's Conviction Integrity team has been reinvestigating this case in complete open file collaboration with the Innocence Project and the Cheney's law firm, who are joint counsel for Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam. Now, our search for the truth was severely impacted by the passage of time. In the decades since the tragic afternoon at the Audubon Bowling, every police investigator and trial attorney on this case has died. In a case that rested entirely on eyewitness testimony, every single eyewitness that testified at trial has died. All of the physical evidence, including the shotgun used in the murder, is gone. No telephone records were obtained at the time, and there is no way to get them now. But what we have obtained in this reinvestigation now are numerous materials that my office tragically did not have in 1965, and thus did not turn over to the defense. Most critically, we have obtained dozens and dozens of reports from the FBI and the NYPD's Bureau of Special Services and Investigations. These records include FBI reports of witnesses who failed to identify Mr. Islam and who implicated other subjects and suspects. And significantly, we now have reports revealing that on orders from Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, the FBI ordered multiple witnesses not to tell police or prosecutors that they were, in fact, FBI informants. Many of those documents were exculpatory. None of them were disclosed to the defense. Without these files, it is clear these men did not receive a fair trial, and in our opinion, their convictions must be vacated. Moreover, under the unique circumstances presented by a 56-year-old case, there can be no retrial on any of the charges contained in the indictment. Therefore, Your Honor, the people believe the indictment against Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam should be dismissed. So, on behalf of the people of the state of New York, together with the attorneys from the Innocence Project and the Cheney's law firm, we jointly move to vacate these convictions on the grounds of newly discovered evidence and the failure to disclose exculpatory evidence at trial, and to dismiss indictment number 871 of 1965 against them. Thank you.
Thank you. Counsel, anything from you?
Yes, Your Honor. Judge Biden, I'm honored to stand here today with my client, Muhammad Aziz, and on behalf of the late Kahlil Islam. Today, in an application we make jointly with the district attorney, as you just heard, Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam moved to vacate their convictions under Criminal Procedure Law, Section 440.10(1)(g), based on newly discovered evidence, and to dismiss the cases against them. As a procedural matter, my clients respectfully request that the records be sealed pursuant to Section 160.50, but the sealing be stayed for 5 days in order so as not to interfere with the significant media coverage taking place here today. In 1965, Muhammad and Kahlil were both innocent young black men who were arrested within weeks of the murder of Malcolm X and falsely accused of participating in that terrible crime. These men became victims of the same racism and injustice that were the antithesis of all that Malcolm X stood for. Before, during, and after these men's trial, the NYPD and FBI covered up a tremendous amount of evidence of their innocence, hiding it even from the district attorney. As a result, when Mujahid Halim from New Jersey testified under oath that he and 4 Confederates killed Malcolm X, and that Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam had nothing to do with it, he was called a liar, while the NYPD and FBI sat on a trove of evidence that corroborated his testimony. The defendants, their lawyers, the court, the prosecution, and the public at large were deceived and cheated. Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam were wrongfully convicted, and most of the men who murdered Malcolm X never faced justice. Muhammad Aziz was 26 years old when his personal nightmare began. Today he is 83. He is a dignified and brave man who has survived enough injustice and suffering for 1,000 lifetimes. Kahlil Islam, a beloved husband, brother, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, died more than a decade ago, still fighting to clear his name. It is tragic that he never lived to see the day of his exoneration, something he very much deserved. Nothing can give back to these men or their families the decades of freedom that were stolen from them. With that being said, District Attorney Cyrus Vance's decision to join us in correcting these wrongful convictions is extremely important, and it was the just and right thing to do. I want to acknowledge also his General Counsel, Carrie Dunn, Assistant District Attorneys Charles King and Peter Castellero for their integrity, professionalism, and candor in this process. I want to thank my co-counsel at the Innocence Project, Barry Scheck and Vanessa Potkin, for working with us on this historic effort. I also want to thank the countless supporters and advocates who have stood behind Muhammad and Kahlil, including many community leaders who denounced this injustice. Among them is the Honorable Albert Vann, former City Councilman and State Assemblyman, who 40 years ago, as chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Legislative Caucus, called for Muhammad and Kahlil's release and aptly noted that neither Malcolm's memory nor justice is served when 2 innocent men languish in prison for a crime they did not commit. I thank Mr. Vann for joining us here today, among our client's many other supporters. Finally, I wish to acknowledge and appreciate Abdur Rahman Muhammad, Rachel Drexen, and Phil Bertelson, who recently created the work, Who Killed Malcolm X? Work that shone a bright light on this tragic injustice and helped us get where we are today. And last, I want to thank the fabulous lawyers in my office, including Morgan Miller and especially Deborah Francois, who traveled the country with me during the pandemic to investigate this case, to get to the truth, and to exonerate 2 innocent men. With that, Your Honor, I give the floor to Barry Scheck.
Your Honor, I join in all the remarks of my colleague, Mr. Shays. It is an honor and a privilege for the Innocence Project to be representing Mr. Aziz and the family of Mr. Islam. The damage done to them and their families by this wrongful conviction is immeasurable. Truth be told, this has been an exoneration in plain sight for decades. Scholars, journalists, and the filmmakers that made Who Killed Malcolm X, Mike Wallace, in 1980, in an incredible episode, also entitled Who Killed Malcolm X, brought forth a lot of the evidence that we have relied upon here today to make the case that these 2 men were wrongfully convicted and that exculpatory evidence was suppressed. Truth be told, today's official acknowledgement that the FBI and NYPD suppressed exculpatory evidence in their possession in 1966, even from the prosecutors, is what led to their wrongful conviction. They would have not been convicted And I think I can fairly say, with the evidence that we saw in the reinvestigation, Mr. Kahlil would have been vindicated. They would have agreed and found the 4 other people that committed this crime with him. If that information, that exculpatory information, had been disclosed, not only would it have changed the verdict in this case, but it would change the history of the civil rights movement in this country. It would not have been a total surprise for the American public to know about what's known as Operation COINTELPRO, which was a systematic effort, unfortunately, by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to disrupt the Black Power and civil rights movement in this country. And it is an enormous tragedy that this assassination occurred on the very day that Malcolm X was about to give a speech announcing and explaining the Organization of African American Unity, which was an extraordinary step in the progress of the civil rights movement in this country. Bitter truth be told, that disclosure of exculpatory evidence to the prosecutors, to the defense, and to the public did not happen. We don't know exactly how or why this exculpatory evidence was suppressed. A reinvestigation was able to get more information, but the bigger question of how or why this happened still remain unanswered. It would be helpful, as Mr. Van, who's here today, and others have called for, a larger investigation with greater access to evidence to get the history right. We think that should happen. But it was beyond the capacity of this conviction reinvestigation process to do that. Now, official acknowledgement of a wrongful conviction is extraordinarily important. It didn't do Mr. Aziz or the family of Mr. Islam, an enormous amount of benefit to know that everybody recognized who had seriously studied this case, that they were innocent. What mattered is what Cyrus Vance, Carrie Dunn, Charles King, and Peter Casolaro did with us in this case, and that is just acknowledge the bitter truth. It's not a great day for celebration, but acknowledging the bitter truth officially, the state admitting that it was wrong, is an enormous step. Now, I know that he's not going to like it, but our friend Peter Casolaro was somebody that we asked Mr. Vance, Mr. Dunn, and Mr. King to work on this case. And Peter Casolaro also worked with Ms. Popkin and I years ago, reinvestigating the case, reinvestigating the case of people we call the Exonerated Five, the people that were wrongly convicted of having attacked the Central Park jogger. And we are really grateful to our colleagues for allowing and assigning Peter to work on this case. He is a brilliant lawyer. He is a person of terrific integrity. Couldn't be here today because of a hip operation, and he's very, very modest. But he is somebody that speaks truth to power. So with that, I turn it over to
I'm going to keep my remarks brief. I know that co-counsel Deborah Francois is going to talk more extensively about the tremendous devastating impact of this wrongful conviction on Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam. I did want to bring into the fold today the family of Malcolm X and the devastation that his assassination brought to his wife, Betty Shabazz, who was with him, his daughters who were in the ballroom and witnessed their father assassinated, and the consequences for his family, and also the consequences for the world. We lost a great leader, and when we look at the criminal legal system and where we are today as we're waiting for justice and verdicts in Rittenhouse case and Ahmaud Arbery, where have we come? We still have a system that works to protect some and oppress others. And what would the world have been had this assassination not taken place? What would Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's life have been if the past 55 years had not been robbed from them and their families? I would just like to reiterate what Barry said, which is this conviction integrity process focused on Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's wrongful convictions, and it unearthed evidence that the FBI and the NYPD hid evidence. These were not just innocent mistakes, and many wrongful convictions aren't. They're the result of official misconduct. And it doesn't stop with this exoneration. We need to know how, we need to know why, and we need to understand the extent of the involvement of the government in both the assassination of Malcolm X and the wrongful conviction of Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. I echo the sentiments of my colleagues that it is a privilege to be here today on behalf of Muhammad Aziz and the late Kahlil Islam. As others have described, it is an understatement to say that Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam have suffered tremendously. Evidence of their innocence was in the hands of the FBI within hours of the murder of Malcolm X. In the weeks and months that followed, the FBI and NYPD continued to amass a wealth of information pointing to 5 men from New Jersey as the true killers of Malcolm X and demonstrating Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's innocence. Both the FBI and NYPD withheld such evidence from the defense and the prosecution, allowing 2 innocent men to spend a combined 42 years in prison. Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's wrongful convictions and decades-long imprisonment caused far-reaching loss for both men, for their families and communities, for Malcolm X's family, and for all of us who believe in and work to uphold the integrity of the criminal justice system. While Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam were denied a fair trial back in 1966, it is not too late to give them a measure of justice today. District Attorney Cyrus Vance has made the just and wise decision to join with us in moving to vacate these men's convictions, dismiss all charges against them, and clear names. It is now my true honor to turn the floor over to Muhammad Aziz.
The events that brought us to court today should never have occurred. Those events were and are the result of a process that was corrupt to its core, one that was all too familiar to black people in 2021. While I do not need this court, these prosecutors, or a piece of paper to tell me I'm innocent, I am very glad that my family, my friends, and the attorneys who have worked and supported me all of these years are finally seeing the truth that we have all known, officially recognized. I'm an 83-year-old man who was victimized by the criminal justice system. I do not know how many more years of creative activity I have. However, I hope the same system that was responsible for this travesty of justice also takes responsibility for the immeasurable harm caused to me during the last 55 or 56 years. Thank you, Your Honor.
Further? Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. The court has reviewed the joint motion that's been filed today, which seeks a vacator of the judgments of conviction of Muhammad Aziz and Kahlil Islam pursuant to Criminal Procedure Law 440.10.1g on the grounds of newly discovered evidence and failure to disclose exculpatory information, and for dismissal of indictment 871 of 1965 against them pursuant to Criminal Procedure Law 21040. With respect to the CPL 440-10-1G motion to vacate, as set forth in that joint motion and through the record established today, the court finds that an earnest reinvestigation has uncovered significant evidence that was not known to the defendants at the time of the trial, which evidence is of such character as to create a probability that had such evidence been received at the trial, the verdict would have been more favorable to the defendants. Under New York law, dismissal of an indictment in the interest of justice is warranted only where such dismissal is required as a matter of judicial discretion by the existence of some compelling factor, consideration, or circumstances clearly demonstrating that the conviction of a defendant upon the indictment would constitute or result in injustice. The court has and must consider the factors set forth in CPL section 21040, sub 1, and as the New York courts have clarified, the court's discretion to dismiss an indictment should be exercised sparingly and, quote, in that rare and unusual case which cries out for fundamental injustice beyond the confines of conventional considerations. That's People versus Exonerates, 109 AD 2D 221, First Department, quoting People versus Belge, 41 New York 2D 60. There can be no question that this is a case that cries out for fundamental justice. This court's paramount purpose is and always has been to uphold the law and pursue justice. To Mr. Aziz and your family, and to the family of Mr. Islam, I regret that this court cannot fully undo the serious miscarriages of justice in this case and give you back the many years that were lost. Dismissal of the indictment is the full extent of this court's authority. But for the reasons set forth in the joint application and based on the record that has been made today, this court's mandate requires that the judgments of conviction be vacated and that the indictment against Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam be dismissed. The joint motion is hereby granted, and the record with respect to Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam will be sealed, and at the party's request, sealing of that record will be stayed for 5 days until November 26th. Thank you very much.